Glory Cloud Podcast, episode 181. Well, stay tuned for Ruth chapter 2 this week. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Glory Cloud Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cahy, and I'm joined by our co-host, Pastor Todd Bordeaux of Cornerstone Orthodox Presbyterian Church in Houston, Texas. How are you doing, Todd?
I'm doing well. How about you?
Yeah, I'm doing all right. Busy week, but I'm doing okay.
Yeah, I was going to mention that since my throat surgery, my vocal cords can go in different places. They're pretty high today, so I may sound even higher than usual. I typically know because when I make phone calls to businesses, they'll hear me and say, "Yes, ma'am."
Oh, my goodness.
So before my surgery, that never happened in my life. So unfortunately, the surgery didn't do quite what they said it would do. So if I sound really high, it's just one of those days.
Okay, well, I'm sorry.
No problem.
Well, shall I do the housekeeping and then we can dive right in?
Sure.
Okay. So we do have our show notes page over at meredithkline.com/podcast. There you can find all of the resources that we mentioned during the course of an episode. We would sure appreciate it if you would give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts and to subscribe to the podcast on whatever you use to listen to it. Both of those things really help to boost our visibility for other people who are looking for good theological content in their podcasts. And finally, if you have the means to pitch in a little bit of money to help us cover the monthly cost of hosting the audio files, you can find a donate button at meredithkline.com/podcast on the right-hand side of the page. And any amount that you can give is very much appreciated. Really does encourage us. And if you don't like the PayPal option behind the donate button, just reach out to us at glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com and we can work something else out. But having said all of that, Todd, how should we start our discussion of Ruth chapter 2?
Well, let me start by saying that if you didn't listen to last week's episode, Ruth chapter 1, I would recommend you turn this one off and go turn that one on and listen first, because this will be really out of order and not make as much sense. We're going to assume that you listened last week so we can pick up where we left off. And so we ended last week looking at the different questions chapter 1 ended that were still open. And so the chief question is, will God still show his covenantal faithfulness to Israel? And that, of course, is most clearly seen in whether he will to Naomi, who needs provision for her future and a family to continue on her husband's name, which of course was very important to the Israelite. And so far, she doesn't have that. There were signs of it at the end of chapter 1. We saw the signs of grace. But we don't have an answer fully yet. And so we read on. Another of the questions is, how can God provide for Naomi, given how desperate her predicament is? No husband, no sons. She's older now. The third question is, what role will Ruth play in all this? Ruth is an unusual character. And she is the big surprise in chapter 1.
Right.
And then, of course, the question for Naomi herself, will she believe in the Lord? We ended chapter 1 with her proclaiming herself bitter that God had left her. And so, will she believe in the Lord as the Lord provides? Now, before we get into chapter 2, let me just say that most of our modern literature, even our modern movies, have discarded the use of subtlety.
That's true.
So movies don't use subtlety anymore. They bang us over the head with the obvious so we know what to feel and think all throughout the movie. But biblical story writers didn't condescend to their readers. Now remember, the Hebrew writers held no dichotomy between artful storytelling and historical accuracy. And so when I say storytelling, you shouldn't think, well, that means it's not historically true. It is historically true. But how they told the story was very important, and they crafted beautiful stories. So in chapter 2 especially, the narrator of Ruth expects us to ask the right questions, to make connections with the rest of Scripture, and sometimes even read between the lines. And so when we read a narrative from the Bible, a story like this, we're not just looking for doctrine, we're entering with our emotions into the story. And so when we come to chapter 2, we are introduced to, again, a new character named Boaz. And we find out he's from the clan of Elimelech. That means he's a potential kinsman redeemer, or as in the Hebrew, a goel. Now, if you go to Leviticus 25, 47 through 49, you can read about the kinsman redeemer. And it says, if a stranger or a sojourner with you becomes rich, and your brother beside him becomes poor, and sells himself to the stranger or sojourner with you, or to a member of the stranger's clan, then after he is sold he may be redeemed. One of his brothers may redeem him, or his uncle or his cousin may redeem him, or a close relative from his clan may redeem him. And so we see that the way the Israelites worked that out is that the nearest relative always had the first option to redeem somebody who's too poor to take care of herself. And so while we're wondering at the end of chapter 1, how is God going to provide for Naomi, in chapter 2, right away we're introduced to a possible solution, and that is with Boaz. Now, it does raise some question. First of all, is Boaz even the nearest relative? Because the nearest relative had the rights to redeem. Is he even willing? Remember, it is the time of the judges, so most people didn't care what God's law said.
Right.
So we shouldn't assume that there'd be even any interest on Boaz's part to help somebody. And does he even know Naomi? Will he ever meet Naomi if he's not in the same town or area? And so it raises a possibility of an answer, but we certainly have to read on as our curiosities are piqued. So the first meeting between Ruth and Boaz is in his field, and that's verses 2 through 11. And so Ruth says to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor. And she said, go, my daughter. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who is of the clan of Elimelech. Now notice how the author introduces Elimelech in verse 1. But it doesn't seem like Naomi or Ruth know about him. And so Ruth just wants to go to a field. And so she hopes she can find favor in the eyes of whoever owns the field. So here's one of those delights in storytelling. Verse 3. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. And then verse 4. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. You see, that's sharing an inside joke. Because believers are reading this, they know the outcome, and they're delighting in God's sovereignty. Out of all the fields, she happened to go to Boaz. That happened means she wasn't planning it. She just happened to stumble upon that particular field. And then Boaz, I'm sure, was very busy as he was in Bethlehem, and he happened to come to his field on that same day. So it says, behold. Why would you start verse 4 and behold? Because the reader is brought inside, drawn into the story of what God is setting up. And so these are little sort of literary cues for you to be drawn in, for someone who already believes in the Lord and believes that he's sovereign, to say, she just happened to, quote unquote, stumble onto Boaz's field. And behold, he happened to be at the field that day, even though he had been in another town. And so that becomes a beautiful way to be drawn in to God's sovereignty, that he happened to be at the field. And so in verse 4, we're introduced to Boaz as far as his faith. Boaz says to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Now, before we get too excited and assume, okay, he's a genuine believer, remember we've already seen a man named Elimelech, whose name means God is my king, but didn't seem to believe it. And Naomi is called pleasant, and she's anything but. And so there's a lot of formulaic words that Israelites used. Even Naomi, and as she was speaking really against the faith in chapter 1, go back to your gods, still spoke of the Lord. And so really it raises a question. Is this a sincere believer? Or simply an Israelite, this is the type of thing you say, "The Lord be with you"? Because remember, it's the time of the judges. Everyone was doing what was right in his own eyes.
Yep.
Very few genuine believers in the land. And so, again, it's drawing you in to read on to find out about him. So any thoughts as we enter the passage on how the author draws us into the story, or anything else on your mind?
Well, do you think it's interesting that Ruth just knew that she could go and glean leftover grain that had fallen on the ground?
You mean with all the danger out there, given how society was?
Well, I mean, maybe it was just a given, but, or maybe it was common knowledge among the Israelites, and that's, how she found out. But I guess as I was working on this passage, I was looking at the foreigner theme in the Old Testament, and I came across Leviticus 23:22 that gives Israel specific instructions that when you reap a field, you aren't to keep everything. You're to let some of it fall to the ground so that the poor and the alien or the stranger can come and gather that. So
are you asking, how did Ruth know anyone would actually do this during this time?
Yeah, like, how did she know that it was a thing that she could just go to a field and pick up the stuff that was on the ground?
What a great question. Yeah, was she being taught the law of God where she knew that's what they were supposed to do? Did she hear from others who gleaned?
Yeah. It's interesting.
Now, for those who don't know, gleaning was you would pick the leftover grain that the workers couldn't put in there. They would fall out of the standing stalks. And so the poor people were allowed to pick those up. So we see something about Ruth's character because the foreman first knows Ruth already by reputation, doesn't he?
Yes.
So we saw how unusual Ruth was to follow Naomi in a very dangerous trip, a foreigner, a Moabite, to be here in Israel. That must have been the talk of the town in a sense.
I imagine it was.
And so here she is, that woman from another country who followed her mother-in-law. And you see that in verse 6. And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab," answering Boaz. And she said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." And notice how the author adds, we see what a hard worker she is. So she came and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. And so the author wants us to know about Ruth, the type of woman she was. She was a godly woman. She worked hard. She was there early morning. She only took short breaks. And all the people, managers out there are thinking, where can I hire someone like that? And so Ruth's character really stands out. And I'm sure it stood out to Boaz. But it raises the question how Boaz is going to respond to a Moabite.
Mm.
Because Moabites didn't have the same rights in Israel. And even whatever officially the law said, you know what most of the Israelites would think. But notice Boaz's response. He's very affectionate. He calls her my daughter. By the way, some people make the mistake of assuming that Ruth is a love story of two young, attractive people, Boaz and Ruth. You know, they sort of do the Hallmark view of Ruth.
Yeah.
But it's pretty clear from the book that Boaz is an older man. We'll see that especially later.
Mm.
And Ruth is a young woman. And so Ruth to marry Boaz will not be because of attraction, or it'll be for sacrifice, and we'll see that later. And so we see his compassion for for Ruth, sorry. He tells her to stay in the field and to keep close to the women so she's protected. Now, all the research I did, we should probably not see in Boaz's admonition a concern for sexual assault, being outdoors in public. But it wasn't uncommon for the paid workers to treat the gleaners roughly.
Okay.
Especially a foreigner.
Right. And I was going to say, you pointed out last week how Hebrew narrative can sometimes tip us off to things if they continue to call someone by where they're from. And I noticed that even in chapter 2 here, she continues to be Ruth the Moabite.
Exactly. And so Boaz charges the young men not to touch her, which may have been some type of harassment, but whatever it is, she was in danger. But then in verse 9, we have a surprise. Boaz says to his workers, and when you are thirsty, go to the vessels, to Ruth, and drink what the young men have drawn. Now, that couldn't have made the workers happy.
Mm.
Now this foreigner, this gleaner, this woman, is allowed to drink of their water, and they have to draw it for her. Now, Ruth is fully aware that she's being treated very unusually. So she falls on her face in verse 10, and she asks the question, why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? And then Boaz responds that he's heard of her reputation and all she's done for her mother-in-law. That was very unusual. And so verse 12, the Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Now that's one of these literary cues that will come up later, because Ruth is going to use that language, isn't she?
Yes. Yep.
She's going to use it to denote marriage, that this is what Boaz was to do for her, take her under his wings. And so we see how all 4 chapters, these 4 parts, will weave these themes in and out. But any other thoughts so far on the story?
I think the reader should be amazed at how Ruth is being treated, because the fact that she continues to be called Ruth the Moabite makes her the other. The narrator is telling us she's not one of us.
Exactly. And so already she's wondering why she's being treated so special, but also the readers are wondering.
Yeah.
We talked about sexual tension. Really, we'll get into that next week. But even here, given how evil most of the men were in Israel, as we see in the book of Judges, and how sexual perversion and immorality was everywhere, the reader is left wondering, what is Boaz doing?
Mm.
What's his motive in all this? And that question will not be answered until chapter 3. But don't go into this thinking everything is just Disney here. This is a very evil time in a very evil society.
Hmm.
And so as we go on, things get more amazing because Boaz grants Ruth not only to drink from the jars that his servants draw, she ends up being able to eat with them also. And so verse 14, and at mealtime Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain. And she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. There's some communion language here. Doesn't it sound like that?
Bread and wine. You're right.
Bread and wine and some left over, and the feeding of the 5,000.
Right.
But you have to wonder what all the workers were thinking as he keeps giving her more and more of these privileges. Now she gets to eat with them. And then verse 16, for them it might get even worse. He says to his workers, "And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." Now that's really a surprise, given she's a Moabite. Because now what he's doing is saying, don't make her look to the, go down, bend over to the ground and find it. You pull out some and give it to her. Now they're probably wondering, okay, what's the boss man doing here and why? They're making us work harder for her. And so we see Ruth's humility in all this in verse 13. Then she said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants." So what we know so far is if Boaz is a believer, then he's quite a generous person. And even Naomi doesn't quite believe that. We'll see in chapter 3. But we learn a lot about Ruth and her humility, her hard work, her sacrifice. We're very impressed with her, aren't we?
Yes, definitely.
And so we're left wondering what was behind Boaz's attitude toward Ruth. Was it simply family devotion? Does he know he's a kinsman redeemer? Is he planning on helping the family? Is he attracted to her? Is he single? Does he need a wife? All kinds of questions that your average Israelite would be wondering, especially knowing how people were. And so as it ends, he continues to bless Ruth, doesn't he?
Yes.
Because we see here, verse 17, so she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. Now that's a lot of barley. That was actually about 2 weeks worth of food.
Wow.
Or 2 weeks worth of it. It would take the normal gleaner 2 weeks to gather what she had. Which means that once you start making bread from that, you'd probably be safe for the winter with food.
Oh, wow.
So you have to imagine what Naomi would be expecting and then what she saw.
Yeah.
Now, we talked about how the story builds anticipation. We see in the end, Ruth returns back to the house. Her mother-in-law saw what she gleaned. Ruth brings out and gives her all the food. And the mother-in-law is full of questions, which is interesting because Ruth doesn't come and simply tell her right away.
Right.
We would expect her to say, "Hey, I met a relative of yours." And I was, right away and telling her everything, but Naomi has to draw it out of her, which is also a way for us to be sort of drawn in. And so the questions pour out of Naomi. Where did you work today? Whose field was it? Ruth is keeping Naomi in anticipation as the author is keeping us in anticipation. We would almost, if it was the first time we'd be calling out, just tell her already.
Yeah.
It's so exciting. And so finally Ruth says, the name of the man I worked with today is Boaz. Now the name Boaz triggers two responses. First, she praises him as one who has shown kindness to the living and the dead. The dead would be her husband Elimelech. So, but that would be odd to say that about simply providing food. That would show kindness to her, but how would it show kindness to Elimelech? So it's very likely Naomi sees more that could happen here.
Right.
That she saw possibilities in Boaz to marry Ruth, and then Ruth would have a child, and she would have a future in Israel. She would have a name in Israel. She would have provision in her old age. So she sees all kinds of possibilities here. The question it leaves us, though, is Naomi still doesn't say anything about the Lord, does she?
No, you're right.
And so she doesn't praise God for what he just provided. And so the question of Naomi's soul, of her faith, still is up in the air, and we have to go to chapter 3 to find out more about what she's thinking. And when we find out what she's thinking, it's not very pleasant, is it?
It's not very Naomi, no.
Yeah. So notice again how the chapter 2 ends with the mention of harvest. And so verse 22, and Naomi says to Ruth, it is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted. So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law. We mentioned in chapter 1 that first part ends with harvest.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go to the end of chapter 3, verse 17, it ends with harvest. So all three of the sections end with a mention of barley harvest. And what does barley harvest represent?
Well, the famine is definitely over.
Yeah, the famine is over. God's covenant blessings to Israel, right?
Right.
Chapter 28.
Yes.
And so each time it raises the question, is God going to be faithful to his promise? Even though we've turned away in the book of Judges, what we see, will God provide to Israel what he promised? Will there be land and seed for God's people forever? The two promises were land and seed. And so will there be a future for Naomi's family in the land, and will there be provision in the land, food? And so the question is not answered yet, but at least we're seeing signs of it, right?
Yes, definitely.
So before we sum up chapter 2, any other thoughts on the actual passage or exegesis?
Yeah, I wanted to back up to verse 14 for just a moment. You tell me if I'm reading too much into this, but at mealtime, Boaz says to Ruth, come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine. And then it says, so she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain. And it seemed to me the image that I got from that was that Boaz was serving Ruth lunch.
Yes.
And so to me, that's some of that irony that you were talking about, because if anyone should be doing the serving in the story, it's Ruth the Moabite. Instead,
Yes.
It's wealthy Boaz who serves Ruth the Moabite. And so I hear echoes of Matthew 20:28 and Mark 10:45, which say that the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many.
Exactly. And chapter 3 will bring this out, that Boaz is a type of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
He is the one in the typology of providing God's promises to both Naomi and Ruth. And again, notice verse 12 is key, where Boaz prays that, or says, the Lord repay you, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. And she ends up taking refuge under Boaz's wings in chapter 3.
Right.
And of course, Psalm 91:4, we have that same famous passage, that's how the Lord is described to Israel, isn't he?
Yes.
He will cover you with his pinions, and under his wings you will find refuge. And so Boaz, the provider, the kinsman redeemer, the Goel, is a picture of Christ in this story. Now we're going to see later on that Ruth also becomes a type of Christ. But in chapter 2, it's Boaz. And so we see that in two ways. One, with the use of that phrase, the shadow of his wings, that will be used for Boaz himself in chapter 3. But also in what you just said, that there's a growing Gentile inclusion theme in chapter 2. Ruth is a Moabite. A Moabite wasn't allowed in the assembly of the Lord when they worshipped.
Mm-hmm.
She had no spiritual status in Israel. And so the chapter starts with a foreigner with no rights. Then she's allowed to glean. Then she's given more privileges than your average gleaner. She's allowed to glean from their stacks instead of the ground that they have to give her. Then they have to begin to draw water for her and share the water. Then she's invited to sit with the other workers where, as you said, Boaz serves her a meal. And then she becomes lifted above the workers. Boaz himself serves her, and they have to serve her.
Right.
And so what you have is a picture of the new covenant. You have in a story a prophecy of the Gentiles giving the privileges of the Jews in the old covenant as they come into their full possession of the kingdom. So what we have here is a glimpse of the church age where Jew and Gentile together bow before the Redeemer, who is the son of Boaz. And so we do have the new covenant being pictured here.
Wow.
So it's really beautiful in one short day, or actually for them a long day, the changes that happened to her.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm going to connect this to Abraham in a moment, but any other thoughts?
The other thought that I had, you kind of already talked about in terms of the communion imagery, but the theme of bread seems to be large here because Bethlehem is the house of bread. We're told at the very beginning of the book that there was no bread, but God has given Israel a bountiful barley harvest, so bread is back. And even though Jesus is primarily talking about the manna in the wilderness, when he says this, we're reminded of what Jesus says in John 6 about being the bread of heaven, the bread of life. So we can see that connection in this story that takes place in Bethlehem.
Yes, bread becomes sort of the symbolic representation of all God's promises. And so bread becomes that, like you said, that major theme. So in the story of Ruth, something new is happening in the history of salvation. And I mentioned last week how there's a constant connection to Abraham. Because it's Abraham who left his home and his way of life by faith to follow God to his promised land, to live in God's presence. And it was Abraham whose descendants were promised the land and promised the covenant of grace. Moabites were excluded from these promises. But now we have this single Moabite woman making a very similar journey as Abraham. Being called by God effectually, she believes, and she takes the trip to Israel like Abraham did, to Canaan. And now she's becoming engrafted into the people of Israel, serving Israel's God, and Boaz lifts her up as equal to any Jewish laborer and even better. And so it's sort of an advance on Abraham. It's Abraham, but even more looking into the new covenant of Jew and Gentile having the same privileges.
Right. You're right, because, I mean, Naomi is, at this point in the story, kind of a foil to Abraham. You were talking about foils last week. Abraham believed and was very glad about God's promises and God's provision, and here Naomi is being bitter. But it's Ruth, the one from outside Abraham's line, who we're really seeing the faith in.
Yes. And on a devotional level, this is the gospel in picture. Boaz reflects the Savior's love to us unworthy sinners, doesn't he?
Yes, absolutely.
We are all Ruth in this story. Christ is our kinsman redeemer that became a member of our human family to bring us from an outwardly accursed place under the shadow of his wings and protection in love. So he becomes our servant and going to the cross for us. And he feeds us the bread and wine of his own body and blood, as Boaz is feeding Ruth. And so we have this eternal love and provision given from going from Boaz to Ruth. And he feeds her bread. It's such a beautiful picture of coming under the shadow of his wings, his protection, his mercy. And we're given all the promises of God that were given to Abraham. So it's a beautiful picture of Christ and what he does for his people.
Absolutely.
And we'll stop, and let's just say the first part of chapter 3 is not quite as beautiful, right?
Yeah, it'll be a little more uncomfortable next week, won't it?
Yes, and it's supposed to be uncomfortable, and it's one of the PG-13 sections of the Bible. And we'll talk about how that plays out next week.
Okay. Well, that was great. I wish every episode could be like this one. Thanks for organizing that.
Sure.
All right. Well, we would love to hear what you think about this, so please do email us at glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com. You can tweet at us. I am at MachinGuy. Todd is at TBordeaux. The podcast itself is at glorycloudpod. I'm also on Instagram as at MachinGuy. But you can also join the discussion over at the Meredith Kline Facebook group. Just let the admins know that you listen to the podcast and they can get you added. And Todd and I will be back again next week with Ruth chapter 3.